Hi, welcome to the Dad Nobody Wants to Listen to You podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking mainly at fare evasion in the New York City subway, which is costing over $800 million in lost fares a year. But it is impossible to look at fare evasion without understanding the whole context of the subway system, including its history, its profit and loss, its investment, its funding, as well as the future. It seems that nobody is terribly happy with the current state of affairs. The passengers are not happy with fares rising. Currently it's $275 for a journey, but at the end of August 2023 it's going to $290, and then the next planned rise is in 2025. The total pay, health and pensions bill every year is $12.2 billion. The managers and investors in the system aren't happy either with the rising costs of investment, debt service, etc. The M.T.A's capital program 2022 to 2024 outlines the need to spend $54.4 billion to keep the system going. The M.T.A network comprises of 6 agencies: the New York City Transit, the Bus Company, the Long Island Railroad, the Metro North Railroad, bridges and tunnels. The situation with New York's buses and underground trains is so serious that this year it's going to lose $11.4 billion. Total revenues for the M.T.A are about $7 billion a year. The total expenses for running the system is about $18.4 billion, leaving a loss of $11.4 billion a year. Why do the millions of dollars being spent every year on fare evasion methods not work? Is the present method of collecting fares through turnstiles using the Omni or the Cash Metro card a sensible approach? Or should they perhaps think about moving to another system, such as the German system, a system that has no turnstiles but works purely on trust, with controllers periodically walking around trains trying to catch people who haven't paid?
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
I want to say right now that I think the M.T.A system is a wonderful system, but it's also a system that needs a lot of help and maybe should be seen in a different way. The New York City subway system is probably one of the most complex subway systems in the world, and it links the boroughs of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx together. It's owned by the New York City government, and it's leased to the New York City Transit Authority. It's one of the oldest systems in the world. It was opened in October 1904, and right now there are over 472 stations in operation. And much of the system runs 24/7, which is more than a lot of the other systems around the world. The system is also one of the world's longest systems, and it contains over 248 miles of routes, which is basically 665 miles of revenue track and a total of 850 miles, including non-revenue track. Portions of the subway outside Manhattan are elevated or sitting on embankments, and there are a few stretches of the ground level track as well. Many lines and stations have express and local services, and these lines have 3 or 4 tracks as well. The signaling system is very old, pre-Second World War. There have been 64 major train accidents since 1918. There are also about 343 subway-related suicides every year. Apart from all the usual dry facts about a metro system, in my research I found so many interesting anecdotes, and it really bears telling you a few of them. It's funny to see how inflation has affected things. In 1904, for instance, you could get in for a nickel, and that is 5 cents. During the course of my study and checking out to see how the New York subway developed, I found all sorts of really interesting facts, and I just have to share a few of them with you. Did you know that it is true that retired subway cars are dumped into the ocean? Apparently, they make a great home for fish. Back in 1904, the cost of a ride on the subway was just 1 nickel. And also, the rats are really there, and I know that most major cities tend to have rats. They say London, you're never more than a few feet from a rat. But anyone who's used the New York subway would probably have seen rats, or at least heard of a story involving a rat. But they are real, and they are such a problem that the network is considered to be infested. They even have trains that used to go up and down, vacuum trains, and they would suck up the rubbish, but they would also suck up the rats. But they've done nothing to really solve the problem. They've tried poison, they've tried every electrical device you can imagine, but they can't get rid of the rats. It's a crime to put your foot on the seat of a train, and they can arrest you for that. I think also it's quite interesting is that people often use mass transit as an excuse for being late for work. But the M.T.A. can actually write a note to your employer if you're late because of them, which I think is quite nice. Like the London Underground, there are a number of abandoned stations and secret stations for VIPs. They're not really used anymore, but there was one near the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And it was very famous because all the rich and famous stayed there, and they had their own underground stop. There's a rule of thumb that the cost of riding the subway is roughly the same as a slice of pizza. So whenever the slice of pizza goes up in price, apparently about the same sort of time, the cost of a ride goes up.
This is Times Square, 42nd Street.
Transfer is available to 178.
Some of my favorite things I found out was that 60% of the subway is underground. And even though New York has the second largest population in the world, it ranks 7 for the number of subway riders. If you've been to Times Square, 42nd Street, well done. That's the busiest station on the New York network. It services nearly 65 million riders a year. Some people also claim that the longest train is the A train, which is 31 miles long, and it takes passengers from 207th Street in Manhattan to Far Rockaway in Queens.
N, Q, and R trains. Transfer is available to the shuttle to Grand Central. Connection is available to the Port Authority bus terminal.
Oh, and there's another secret doorway from a platform in Times Square, 42nd Street, that leads straight into the Knickerbocker Hotel. Apparently F. Scott Fitzgerald and company used to go to parties there. There's a mural by Roy Lichtenstein in the 42nd Street station that people love to admire. The Walworth building has its own secret entrance. Many ghost stations, I think there are about 5 of them that were in service, probably before the war. And I think everyone remembers that during the late 70s and early 80s, when crime was at the highest, there was a vigilante group that used to patrol the subways to protect the riders, and they formed what they called, I think, the Magnificent 13, and they grow to become the Guardian Angels. There was a train that was the number 4 train, which was nicknamed the Muggers Express, probably a much more exciting name than the Lexington Avenue Express. There is another last story that I think is pretty fun to know about, is that there is a haunted station. It's the Astor Place station. A lavish ghost train is supposed to pass through the station late at night, and it picks up unsuspecting passengers and brings them back in time to the early 1900s. That sounds like a lot of fun. What is the future of the subway and the M.T.A. generally? Obviously, it cannot continue the way it is with such debt. There's been all sorts of talk over the years about how to enforce the fares. There's lots of talk about how to alternatively fund the system, and I wanted to discuss a few of those ideas. In terms of extra funding, it's been proposed that you could take the tax that's leveled on gas or petrol and give that to the M.T.A. That could generate nearly $500 million a year. Another very good way to improve revenues is to improve the quality of your experience. I think that most people who travel on the M.T.A. in some capacity or not feels it's pretty dirty. The stations are pretty disgusting. The trains are much better than they used to. As I mentioned earlier, they used to be covered in graffiti, and they're really nice now, and they're very cold. But the whole experience of going into the M.T.A. and going around it is not terribly nice, and a lot of people would prefer to take their cars. And that's a huge problem for pollution, and is something that's obviously being fought in other countries and in other cities around the world, such as London, with a congestion charge. That's a charge that penalizes people for driving their cars into the city. This was proposed very seriously a few years ago in New York, and there was tremendous debate and argument. But it's going ahead. As of 2024, albeit 16 months late, it is supposed to start. And the way it's going to work is that any car that goes into Manhattan below 60th Street will be charged anything up to $23 a day in congestion charge. And this will be monitored using cameras and systems. But as I mentioned too, the debt of the M.T.A. is so huge and the capital program so big, it's highly unlikely that any of the money that's generated is going to go back to the employees or to the customers in terms of fare reductions. It's probably all going to go to pay the capital budget. But as the capital plan is so reliant on the additional funding that's going to come from the central business district tolling system, even a portion of that would more than pay for the fares of the metro. There is already a system called Fare Fares in New York. That's designed for people who are earning $27,000 a year or less. You could lower that even more, and that threshold could be as low as $10,000 a year. That would encourage people who probably are evading fares at the moment because they can't afford it to pay, and that would help the system. But for now, it seems to be enforcement is the way to go. There was even a report that was produced, a 65-page report, in fact, called the 2023 Fare Evasion Report. This is what they consider a blue ribbon panel of experts who got together to decide what could be done about fare evasion. Fare evasion is a serious problem, as I said, and it's costing nearly $800 million a year, but it tends to be a system that is going to be designed to target Black and Latinos, since they make up 94% of the people who are evading fares. Targeting ethnic groups tends to be completely counterproductive. Normally, you can end up having big arguments with people who cannot afford their fares, and going after somebody through court and finding them or maybe even deporting them all over $2.75 seems to be kind of ridiculous. It's so ridiculous, in fact, that nowadays nobody bothers. When I was there, I saw the police standing at the turnstiles, and people would be jumping over the barriers and nothing was said, nothing was done. And it was explained to me just that it's not worth their time and effort to arrest people and charge them, because more likely than not, they'll just be stung with a civil rights lawsuit. From a personal experience, in my last visit last month, I remember I was going on a journey and I had to transfer from one line to another. I couldn't find a way out of the station that would take me directly to the other transfer point. So I knew that if I got out of the station, I'd have to pay again. I wasn't very happy about that. But I did arrive, and I arrived at the gate, and I could see a bunch of people standing there, not wanting to pay, as usual, waiting for somebody to open the emergency gate so you could get free entry into the system. I, with my kids, decided to do the same because I felt I'd already paid, so why should I pay again? A lady dressed in an M.T.A. t-shirt saw us from the other side. She pushed the emergency gate wide open and said, "Okay, guys, because I love you, come on in." And I thought, well, what hope is the system if they have employees who are just letting people in anyway? But fare evasion is not just limited to people who jump over turnstiles at the underground. It happens on the buses. People get into the back of the bus, and I saw that frequently myself. Even if you're driving your car across a bridge and you don't wish to pay the toll, people have resorted to very creative methods, such as changing their license plates. Whole parking lots of stolen cars have even been found with false number plates. And they researched these cars, and it turns out that they probably have tens of thousands of dollars of outstanding tolls on them. And this is not even mentioning the people who actually try to break the machines in order to get in. It's well known that in the underground you can squeeze around the barrier and get in free. They even have a rather strange name for this. It's called back-cocking. The M.T.A, like every business in the world right now, is even trying AI to limit fare evasion. They've used lasers, high-frequency devices, private investigators, and of course, as I've seen in some of the bigger stations, police and attendants. Most of the time, the attendants sit in their glass box and they do absolutely nothing when they see people climbing over the barriers. So I don't think it's going to work just by increasing the number of people there to guard the system. But with fare evasion being nearly 24% of the revenue of the underground system, you can see how it's a serious problem. And this leads to my final point. How about making the system free on entry? And now that sounds like a very radical idea, and I don't think it's something that's been tried in many places in the world, apart from perhaps Luxembourg. But in effect, it could end up being the best way forward. How would that work? Well, you'd make huge savings from enforcement. You wouldn't have to pay for all these police and attendants anymore, who don't seem to be doing very much anyway. You would save from the maintenance of the barrier systems. You wouldn't have to put any more barrier systems in. And if you look at the capital program, that represents many, many millions every year. The new central business district tolling, which is going to be starting next year, is obviously a very good way to generate additional funding for the metro. London has such a similar system. I'm not sure that it's quite as clear that the money is going to pay for the London Underground, but in effect, that's what's happening. The system is obviously sold to the public as a way to reduce the noise and the pollution in the city. And I think that's probably working. The evidence seems to indicate that the number of cars coming into London has declined. But I think with the hundreds of thousands of cars that are coming into Manhattan on a daily basis generally, it would be a great system if you could actually get people out of their cars and into the metro system. Therefore, you'd be generating perhaps more revenues. But as you can see, there's so many contradictions there. The more people who are coming out of their car, the less central business district tolling you're going to get. If you want to make the underground system free, you're not going to get any revenues from more people using it. One area that really sticks out for me, of course, is that the system has to service its debts, and that's costing $3 billion a year. If that could be dealt with, suddenly you'd have all that extra money to make up for the fare loss. So as I think I've shown you, nobody is terribly happy with the system that exists at the moment. The system runs. It's a very, very clever system, but it's getting increasingly expensive. And in terms of running it as a business, it makes a thumping loss every year and requires billions to be pumped into it all the time to keep it going. Fare evasion is a serious problem. Not only is it bad for the civil culture of New York, people don't like standing there and seeing people jumping over the turnstiles while they're having to pay. It creates a tremendous feeling of inequality. Fare evasion has become a serious problem, but it's not just linked to the 94% of Latinos and black people. There was a video on television in America only a few weeks ago that showed an apparently affluent white person getting in at an Upper East Side station, jumping the turnstiles with a ticket in his hand, and feeling very pleased with himself. People like him clearly can pay, but it's become so common that they feel, well, why should I? Students, they get discounts, but they are limited in the hours that they can travel. But they have this feeling that, well, I have a ticket that allows me free travel at certain times. Why not use it at weekends and at the time that I'm not actually supposed to use it? And of course they do, if they don't just jump over the turnstiles. And as I said, there is really no enforcement. Nobody really cares. I think you'd have to be pretty silly to get caught. You'd have to jump over a turnstile right in front of a police officer and probably stick up your middle finger at him. But even if you are caught, the current guidance to the New York City Police is just to make them pay. It's not worth going through the process of arrests and summons, just over $2.75. So my big idea is really from something I saw when I was in Long Island in the Hamptons. I was really thrilled to see how they had signs asking people would they like to adopt a road. It's an increasing thing over the world now to get corporate businesses to sponsor things. Or why not get sponsoring for the stations from businesses that are nearby those stations? They could own those stations. They could decorate them in their corporate colors. They could clean them up. They could help pay for the general upkeep of these places. You make entry into the New York subway and buses free. You subsidize that using the new congestion charge. You save money by eliminating the use of turnstiles or people to collect and all the various security people and tools that they're using at the moment. And you end up getting a system that will become internationally famous because it'll be clean, it'll be tidy, it's free, and what a tourist attraction that would be. Well, as my son would say, Dad, nobody wants to listen to you about New York. After all, it's never going to happen.